The needle pierced my flesh with the precision of a surgeon's blade, but the hands that guided it belonged to a doctor who had sold his soul for 30 pieces of silver and the approval of a woman whose cruelty knew no bounds. I, Mercy, lay strapped to a wooden table in the basement of the Harlow Plantation house while Dr. Whitfield sewed my lips together with thick cotton thread, each stitch a violation that would haunt us both for the rest of our lives. "Make sure the stitches are tight," Mistress Beatrice commanded from her position beside the table, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed she had found the perfect solution to an ongoing problem. "I want her mouth sealed completely. No more talking back, no more insolence, no more of her uppity opinions about things that are none of her concern." The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as the needle continued its terrible work, but I kept my eyes fixed on Beatrix's face, memorizing every line of satisfaction, every cruel smile, every moment of pleasure she took in my suffering. She thought she was silencing me forever. But she was actually creating something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and a burning desire for justice that would consume everything in its path. Before we continue with this harrowing tale of resistance and revenge, I'd love to know where you're listening to this story from. Drop a comment below and let me know what city or country you're in. It's amazing how these stories of courage connect people across the globe. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear these untold music histories. My crime, according to Mistress Beatrice, had been simple. I had spoken the truth when silence was expected, had dared to voice observations that cut too close to the bone of her carefully constructed facade. The confrontation that led to this moment had taken place 3 days earlier in the parlor, where I had been dusting the expensive furniture that Beatrice used to display her wealth and social status. The morning had begun like any other in the 8 years I had served in the Harlow household. I had risen before dawn to prepare breakfast for the family. Music had cleaned the kitchen while they ate, and had begun my daily routine of maintaining the pristine, music appearance that Beatrice demanded of her home. Every surface had to gleam, every ornament had to be perfectly positioned. Every room had to reflect the image of Southern gentility that she worked so hard to project. But beneath the surface of that carefully maintained facade, I had observed the rot that was eating away at the foundation of the Harlow family. Master Richard Harlow was a weak man who had long since surrendered control of his household to his wife's increasingly erratic demands. He spent most of his time in his study, drinking bourbon and avoiding the confrontations that had become a daily feature of life under Beatrix's rule. Their 2 children, Margaret and James, had been shaped by their mother's cruelty into miniature versions of her worst qualities. Margaret, at 16, already showed signs of the same casual sadism that defined Beatrice's treatment of the slaves. James, at 14, music had learned to deflect his mother's attention by joining in her persecution of those who could not fight back. The household staff lived in constant fear of Beatrice's unpredictable moods and creative punishments. She had once forced a house slave named Sarah to stand in the sun for 12 hours without water because she had failed to dust a picture frame to Beatrice's satisfaction. Another slave, an elderly man named Moses, had been made to sleep in the stables for a week because he had coughed during one of Beatrice's dinner parties. But I had always been her particular target. Perhaps because my literacy and intelligence reminded her of her own intellectual limitations, or perhaps because she sensed in me a strength of character that she could never break completely. Over the years she had subjected me to countless humiliations and punishments, each one designed to remind me of my place in her carefully ordered world. "You move too slowly, Mercy," she had said that fateful morning, her voice carrying the perpetual irritation that seemed to define her relationship with everyone around her. A proper servant anticipates her mistress's needs instead of dawdling about like a lazy field end. I had been working in the Harlow household for 8 years, had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Beatrix's moods and demands, had perfected the art of invisible efficiency that kept house slaves alive and employed. But that morning, something inside me had finally snapped. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of pretending that her cruelty was normal. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 8 years of systematic humiliation. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that some truths were too important to keep buried. The breaking point had come when I witnessed Beatrix's treatment of little Emma, a 6-year-old slave child who worked in the kitchen under my supervision. Emma had accidentally dropped a plate while helping to clear the breakfast dishes, and Beatrice had responded by slapping the child so hard that she fell to the floor, blood streaming from her nose. "Clumsy little animal," Beatrice had snarled, standing over the crying child with her hand raised for another blow. Perhaps a day without food will teach you to be more careful with my property. It was then that I had stepped forward, placing myself, music, between Beatrice and the terrified child, my body shaking with a rage that I could no longer contain. She's just a baby, I had said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. She made music a mistake. That doesn't give you the right to beat her like an animal. The silence that followed was electric with danger, but I had passed the point of caring about consequences. The words that had been building inside me for years were finally demanding release, and I found myself unable to stop them. I move slowly because I'm tired, I had continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Tired of pretending that your cruelty is justified, tired of acting like your unhappiness, music, gives you the right to make everyone around you miserable. How dare you? Beatrice had whispered, her face going white with shock and rage. How dare you speak to me that way? You're cruel because you're unhappy. I had pressed on, the truth pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. And you're unhappy because you're empty inside, empty of love, empty of purpose, empty of everything that makes life worth living. You think that hurting other people will fill that emptiness, music, but it only makes it bigger. The transformation in Beatrix's face was terrifying to behold. The mask of Gentile Southern womanhood fell away completely, revealing the monster that lurked beneath. Her eyes blazed with a fury that seemed almost inhuman. Her hands trembled with the desire to inflict violence. And her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a menace that made the music air itself seem dangerous. You forget your place, she had said, each word dripping with venom. You forget what you are, forget who owns you. Forget that your very existence depends on my mercy. I know exactly what I am, I had replied, finally turning to face her directly. I'm a human being with eyes and a brain and the ability to see through the lies you tell yourself, and what I see is a woman who has everything, wealth, status, power over other people's lives, and who is still miserable because she's rotten inside. That was when she had summoned Dr. Whitfield, the family physician who had been treating the Harlow family for over a decade, and who had long since learned that his continued employment depended on his willingness to participate in whatever cruelties his patients demanded. Music. He had arrived within the hour, carrying his medical bag and the moral flexibility that made him valuable to people like Beatrice. I want you to sew her mouth shut, Beatrice had told him without preamble, her voice carrying the cold calculation of someone who had found the perfect punishment for an unforgivable crime. Use thick thread, make the stitches tight, and ensure that she cannot speak again. Music until I decide to have them removed. The slave has forgotten that her voice belongs to me, and I intend to reclaim it permanently. Dr. Whitfield had hesitated for a moment. His medical training wearing with his financial interests and his fear of Beatrix's displeasure. Mistress Harlow, he had said carefully, such a procedure could be dangerous. The risk of infection, the inability to eat or drink music properly. I don't care about the risks, Beatrice had interrupted, her voice rising with excitement as she contemplated the suffering she was about to inflict. I care about teaching this uppity slave that there are consequences for speaking out of turn. If she dies from the procedure, then she dies. If she lives, then she lives as a reminder to every other slave on this plantation about what happens to those who forget their place. The basement where they took me, music, to perform the procedure was a place of shadows and suffering where Beatrice had conducted her most music-creative punishments over the years. The walls were stained with the blood of previous victims, and the air carried the lingering scent of fear and desperation that had soaked into the very stones. Dr. Whitfield's hands shook as he prepared his instruments, his face pale with the recognition of what he was about to do to another human being. But his fear of Beatrice's displeasure was stronger than his medical ethics, and he proceeded with the barbaric surgery that would transform me from a speaking person into a silenced object. Hold her down, he instructed the two male slaves who had been brought to assist with the procedure. This needs to be done quickly and precisely if she's going to survive it. The leather straps that bound me to the table cut into my wrists and, music, ankles as I struggled against my restraints. But there was no escape from what was about to happen. I could only watch as Dr. Whitfield threaded his needle with the thick cotton thread that would seal my mouth for weeks to come. Please, I whispered, making one last appeal to whatever humanity might remain in the man who was about to mutilate me. Don't do this, you're a doctor. You took an oath to do no harm. I'm sorry, he replied, but his hands continued their preparations. I have no choice. If I refuse, she'll find someone else to do it, music, and they might not be as careful as I will be. And so I found myself strapped to a table in the basement, feeling the needle pierce my flesh again and again, as Dr. Whitfield reluctantly carried out music, his patient's demands. Each stitch was a violation. Each pull of the thread a theft of something fundamental to my humanity. But even as my mouth was sealed shut, even as my voice was stolen from me, I felt something else growing inside me. A rage so pure and focused that it felt like a living thing, feeding on my pain and growing stronger with each moment of suffering. "There," Dr. Whitfield said finally, his voice hollow with shame as he completed the last stitch. "It's done. Her mouth is sealed." Her mouth as Beatrice examined his handiwork with the satisfaction of an artist admiring a completed painting, her eyes bright with pleasure as she contemplated the weeks of suffering that lay ahead for me. "Perfect," she said. Now she can think about her insolence in silence, can contemplate the consequences of speaking out of turn without the ability to voice any more of her offensive opinions. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a burning agony that seemed to consume my entire face, but worse than the physical pain was the psychological impact of what had been done to me. I had been reduced from a speaking person to a mute object, from a human being with thoughts and opinions to a silenced piece of property that existed solely for its owner's pleasure. As they carried me back to the small room where I was confined, I began to understand the full magnitude of what Beatrice had done. She had not just punished me for speaking out of turn. She had attempted to destroy the very thing that made me human, the ability to communicate my thoughts and feelings to the world around me. But she had made a crucial mistake. She had assumed that silencing my voice would break my spirit, that taking away my ability to speak would somehow diminish my capacity for thought and action. But the opposite was true. Without the outlet of speech, my rage had nowhere to go but inward, where it crystallized into something harder and more dangerous than mere anger. I began to plan my revenge from the moment they locked me in that room, my mind working with a clarity and focus that surprised me. The woman who had ordered my mouth sewn shut had made herself my enemy in the most personal way possible, and I would not rest until she had paid for her cruelty with her life. The needle that had sewn my mouth shut would soon find a new purpose, and the woman who had ordered my silence would discover that some voices could not be permanently stilled. They could only be transformed into something far more dangerous than words. The first few hours after the procedure were the worst, as the reality of my situation began to sink in, and the full extent of my suffering became clear. I could not speak, could barely swallow, could only breathe through my nose while fighting the constant urge to open my mouth and scream. The stitches pulled at my flesh with every movement. Every attempt to eat or drink became an exercise in agony, and the growing infection around the wounds filled my mouth with the taste of corruption and decay. Dr. Whitfield had left me with basic instructions for care. Rinse with salt water if possible. Try to consume liquids through the gaps between my teeth and avoid any movement that might tear the stitches. But these instructions were easier given than followed, and I quickly discovered that even the simplest acts of survival had become monumental challenges. Music. The room where I was confined was barely large enough for a bed and a small table with a single window that provided just enough light to see the extent of my prison. Beatrice had chosen this space deliberately, knowing that its isolation would prevent me from communicating with other slaves who might offer comfort or assistance. I was to suffer alone, cut off from the human contact that might have made my ordeal bearable. The first attempt to drink water was a nightmare of pain and frustration. The liquid pulled behind my sealed lips, unable to flow naturally down my throat, forcing me to tilt my head back at impossible angles and try to force the water through the tiny gaps between my teeth. Most of it spilled down my chin and onto my dress, leaving me thirsty and humiliated by my own helplessness. Eating was even worse. The small portions of gruel that were brought to me twice a day had to be consumed one tiny spoonful at a time, each mouthful requiring careful manipulation to avoid tearing the stitches that held my lips together. The process was so slow and painful that I often gave up halfway through, preferring hunger to the agony of trying to nourish myself through my sealed mouth. But perhaps the worst part of my ordeal was the psychological impact of being unable to speak. For 26 years, my voice had been my primary means of expressing my thoughts, feelings, and identity. I had used words to comfort crying children, to share stories with fellow slaves, to assert my humanity in a world that sought to deny it. Now suddenly, I was reduced to gestures and written words. My rich inner life trapped behind a barrier of thread and flesh. The infection began on the third day, announcing itself with a fever that left me shivering despite the Georgia heat. The stitches had been pulled too tight, cutting off circulation to the surrounding tissue, and bacteria had found their way into the wounds despite Dr. Whitfield's attempts at sterile technique. My face swelled until my eyes were nearly closed, and the constant throbbing pain made it impossible to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. It was during this period of crisis that I began to understand the true depth of Beatrice's cruelty. She visited me daily, ostensibly to check on my condition, but actually to gloat over my suffering and to remind me of the lessons I was supposed to be learning from my punishment. "Are you ready to apologize for your insolence?" she asked during one such visit, her voice carrying the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had successfully broken her victim's spirit. "Are you prepared to acknowledge that your voice belongs to me, that your thoughts and opinions are worthless unless I choose to hear them?" I could not respond with words, but my eyes spoke volumes about the rage and contempt I felt for her cruelty. She saw that defiance in my gaze and smiled with pleasure, understanding that my continued resistance meant her entertainment would last longer than she had initially hoped. "Still stubborn," she observed, circling my bed like a predator, examining wounded prey. "Still too proud to accept the reality of your situation. Perhaps a few more weeks with your mouth sewn shut will teach you the humility that you so clearly lack." But I could see in her eyes that my continued resistance was disturbing her, that she had expected me to be broken, music by now, reduced to a cowering shadow of my former self. Instead, she found herself facing someone who had been refined by suffering, transformed by injustice into something harder and more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. The other slaves in the household learned of my situation through the network of whispered communication that connected every plantation, and I began to receive small gestures of support that helped sustain me through the darkest periods of my ordeal. A cup of cool water left by my bedside, a piece of soft bread that could be consumed more easily than the usual gruel, a gentle touch on my shoulder from someone who understood that I was fighting for all of us. These acts of kindness were dangerous for those who performed them. Beatrice had made it clear that anyone caught assisting me would face severe punishment, but they continued nonetheless. Proof that the bonds of human solidarity could not be broken by any amount of cruelty or intimidation. It was little Emma, the 6-year-old whose defense had led to my punishment, who provided the most meaningful support. She would slip into my room when the house was quiet, bringing me small gifts, a flower picked from the garden, a smooth stone she had found by the creek, a drawing she had made with charcoal on a piece of bark. She could not understand the full significance of what had been done to me, but she knew that I was suffering because I had tried to protect her. "I'm sorry, Miss Mercy," she whispered during one of her visits, her small hand stroking my fevered forehead. "I'm sorry she hurt you because of me." I could not speak to comfort her, could not explain that my choice to defend her had been worth any amount of suffering, could not tell her that her visits were the only thing keeping me sane during the long nights of pain and isolation. But I could touch her hand and look into her eyes, trying to communicate through gesture and expression the love and gratitude that words could no longer convey. Dutep Whitfield's daily visits became a strange form of torture in themselves, as he struggled with the guilt of what he had done, while trying to keep me alive long enough to satisfy Beatrice's desire for prolonged suffering. His hands were gentle, as he cleaned my wounds and applied whatever treatments might prevent the infection from killing me. But I could see the shame eating away at his soul with each passing day. "I'm sorry," he whispered during his second visit, his voice barely audible as he cleaned the infected stitches with alcohol that burned like liquid fire. "I should have refused. I should have found the courage to say no regardless of the consequences." I could not respond with words, but my eyes spoke volumes about the rage and contempt I felt for his weakness, his willingness to torture an innocent person rather than risk his comfortable position as physician to the wealthy. He saw that judgment in my gaze and flinched from it as if I had struck him. "I know you hate me," he continued, his hands trembling as he worked. "I know you have every right to hate me, but I want you to know that I will find a way to make this right, to undo what I have done to you." It was then that I began to understand that Dr. Whitfield might be more than just an obstacle to overcome. He might be a tool that could be used to achieve the justice that Beatrice so richly deserved. His guilt was eating him alive, transforming him from a complicit bystander into a potential ally who might be willing to help me escape the hell that his own hands had created. The infection worsened during the second week, despite Dr. Whitfield's treatments, and I could feel my strength ebbing as my body fought the poison that was spreading through my system. My face swelled until my eyes were nearly closed. My fever spiked so high that I drifted in and out of consciousness, and for several days it seemed likely that Beatrice would get her wish to see me die from the consequences of my own defiance. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. I fought the infection with the same stubborn determination that had led me to speak the truth in the first place. Drawing strength from my hatred and my burning desire to see justice done, I forced myself to consume the bitter medicines that Dr. Whitfield brought, endured the agony of having my wounds cleaned and redressed, and slowly began to win the battle against the corruption that threatened to claim my life. It was during this period of crisis that I began to formulate the plan that would eventually lead to Beatrice's death. The fever had given me strange dreams and visions, and in one of them, I saw myself standing over her bed holding the same needle and thread that had been used to torture me. The image was so vivid, so satisfying that I began to think of it not as a dream, but as a prophecy, a glimpse of the justice that awaited both of us. The plan that began to form in my mind was elegant in its simplicity and poetic in its justice. Beatrice would die the same way she had tried to kill me, choking on her own blood, unable, music, to speak, unable to call for help, unable to do anything but experience the terror and helplessness that she had inflicted upon me. But first, I needed to survive my ordeal and find a way to convince Dr. Whitfield to remove the stitches that held my mouth closed. His guilt was my weapon. His shame was my opportunity, and his growing recognition of the evil he had participated in was the key to my eventual freedom. As the infection slowly began to recede, and my strength gradually returned, I started to communicate with music Dr. Whitfield through written messages carefully crafted to exploit his guilt and turn him into an active participant in my plans for revenge. "Help me," I wrote on a piece of paper during one of his visits. "You know what she is. You know what she's capable of. Help me stop her before she destroys someone else." He stared at the words for a long moment, understanding their full implications. He was being asked to become an active participant in whatever revenge I was planning, to cross the line from reluctant accomplice to willing conspirator in what would almost certainly be a capital crime. "If I help you, music," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if I remove these stitches, what will you do?" I wrote one word on the paper, underlining it for emphasis. "Justice." He nodded slowly, his decision made. "Tomorrow music night," he said. "I'll come after midnight when she's taken her lord and the house is asleep. I'll remove the stitches then." The final week of my captivity passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing me closer to the moment when I would finally be free to speak and to act. I used the time to refine my plans, to study Beatrice's routines even more carefully, music, to prepare for the confrontation that would end with one of us dead and the other transformed forever. The woman who had sewn my mouth shut was about to discover that some voices could not be permanently silenced, and that the needle she had used to torture me would soon find a new and more fitting purpose in the service of justice. Dr. Whitfield's transformation from reluctant participant to active conspirator was a gradual process driven by guilt that consumed him more completely with each passing day. I watched him struggle with the weight of what he had done, saw the shame eating away at his professional pride and personal integrity, and recognized in his suffering an opportunity to turn my torturer into my liberator. Music. His visits to monitor my condition became longer and more frequent as the infection threatened my life, and during these sessions, I began to glimpse the man he had been before fear and greed had corrupted his medical ethics. He spoke to me not as property, but as a fellow human being. His voice filled with genuine concern for my welfare and growing horror at his own actions. "I became a doctor to heal people," he told me during one of his evening visits. His hands gentle as he cleaned my wounds with a solution that burned but prevented further infection. "I took an oath to do no harm, to use my skills in service of life rather than suffering. What I did to you, it goes against everything I was trained to believe about the sacred nature of medicine." I could not respond with words, but I wrote on the slate he had provided, "Not too late to remember who you were." He stared at the words for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "Isn't it?" he asked. "How do you come back from something like this? How do you redeem yourself after participating in such evil?" "By stopping it," I wrote. "By making sure it never happens again." The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, transforming him from my captor into something approaching an ally. He began to bring me additional medicines that he purchased with his own money, spent longer periods tending to my wounds, and started speaking to me about his own history and the choices that had led him to this moment. "I wasn't always like this. Music," he said during one of our sessions, his voice heavy with regret. When I first started practicing medicine, I had principles, ideals about using my skills to help people regardless of their race or social position. But the wealthy families who could afford my services expected certain accommodations. They wanted a doctor who would ask no questions, music, who would participate in their cruelties without moral objection. He paused, his hands stilling as he contemplated the path that had brought him to this basement room where he was treating wounds he had inflicted. The first time I compromised my principles, it was for a relatively small thing, treating a slave's injuries without reporting the obvious signs of abuse to the authorities. I told myself it was better to help the victim than to take a stand that would accomplish nothing except ending my career. But each compromise made the next one easier until I found myself capable of this. I wrote on my slate, "Music, still time to choose differently, is there?" He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if I help you now, even if I try to make amends, how do I live with what I've done? How do I look at myself in the mirror knowing that I used my medical skills to torture an innocent person? By ensuring justice," I wrote, "by making sure Beatrice pays for her crimes." It was then that I began to share with him the details of my plan, writing out my intentions in careful script that left no doubt about what I intended to do once my mouth was freed from its prison of thread and flesh. Dr. Whitfield read my words with growing alarm, understanding that he was being asked to participate not just in my liberation, but in premeditated murder. "You want to kill her?" he said. Music, his voice carrying a mixture of horror and fascination. "So, you want to use the same method she used on you?" "Justice," I wrote again. "She tried to kill me slowly with infection and starvation and despair. She deserves to experience the same terror, the same helplessness, the same understanding that death is approaching, and there is nothing she can do to stop it." "But murder," he began. Music, his medical training warring with his growing recognition that conventional justice would never reach someone like Beatrice. "Self-defense," music, I wrote, "she will never stop. If I survive this, she will find new ways to torture me, new punishments, music to inflict, and she will do the same to others, to little Emma, to any slave who shows signs of intelligence or independence. The only way to stop her is to end her life." Dr. Whitfield struggled with the moral implications of what I was proposing. Music, his conscience torn between his oath to preserve life and his growing understanding that some lives were so corrupted by evil that their continuation posed a threat to innocent people. "What if we tried to expose her instead?" he suggested. "What if we documented her cruelties and presented evidence to the authorities?" I wrote my response with bitter clarity. Who would believe a slave's word against a white woman's? Who would prosecute a plantation owner for disciplining her property? The law protects people like her, not people like me. He knew I was right. Of course, the legal system that governed our world was designed to protect the interests of slave owners, not to provide justice for their victims. Beatrice could torture and kill her slaves with impunity, secure in the knowledge that no court would ever hold her accountable for her actions. "Then what you're proposing?" "It's the only form of justice available to you," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "Yes," I wrote, "music, and you are the only person who can make it possible. The decision to help me was not made quickly or, music, easily." Dr. Whitfield spent days wrestling with the implications of what I was asking, understanding that by removing my stitches, he would be enabling a murder that could result in his own execution if discovered. But his guilt over what he had done to me, combined with his growing recognition of Beatrice's evil, eventually overcame his fear of consequences. "I'll do it," he told me during one of his final visits before the planned liberation. "I'll remove the stitches tomorrow night, and I'll provide you with whatever you need to complete your plan. But I want you to understand that this makes me as guilty as you are. If we're caught, we'll both hang. Better to hang for striking back against evil than to live as its accomplice," I wrote. He nodded, understanding that I had given voice to the truth he had been struggling to accept. His participation in my torture had already made him guilty of crimes against humanity. Helping me achieve justice would at least allow him to redeem some small portion of his corrupted soul. The preparations for my liberation were made with careful attention to detail, as we planned not just my escape from the stitches, but the execution of the revenge that would follow. Dr. Whitfield would provide the needle and thread needed to seal Beatrice's mouth along with enough laudanum to ensure she remained unconscious during the initial stages of the procedure. "She takes her evening dose at 10 o'clock, he told me, music, as we finalized our plans. "By 11 o'clock, she'll be deeply asleep. That would be the safest time to music act." How long will the Lord keep her unconscious in? I wrote with the additional dose I'll provide at least 4 hours. He replied, long enough for you to complete your work and escape before anyone discovers what's happened. And afterward I wrote, what will you tell them when they find her body? The truth, as far as I know it, he said, that she was found dead in her bed with her mouth sewn shut, apparently the victim of some kind of bizarre suicide or accident. I'll suggest that her guilt over what she did to you finally drove her to madness, that she inflicted the same torture on herself that she had ordered me to inflict on you. It was a plausible story given Beatrice's known instability and her increasing cruelty, music, in recent months. The authorities would find it easier to believe that she had suffered some kind of mental breakdown than to accept that her property had successfully planned and executed such a sophisticated revenge. The night before my liberation, Dr. Whitfield brought me a final gift, a small mirror that allowed me to see my face for the first time since the procedure had been performed. The reflection that stared back at me was shocking in its transformation. My lips were swollen and distorted by the stitches. My face was gaunt from weeks of inadequate nutrition, and my eyes held a hardness that had not been there before. But I also saw something else in that reflection. Strength, determination, and a sense of purpose that had been forged in the fires of suffering and injustice. The woman who had been silenced for speaking truth had been transformed into something more dangerous than Beatrice could ever have imagined. Are you ready? Music, Dr. Whitfield asked as he prepared to leave for the final time before our plan was put into action. I wrote one last message on my slate. I have been ready since the first stitch was made. He nodded and gathered his medical supplies, understanding that the next time we met, it would be to undo the damage he had inflicted and to begin the process that would end with Beatrice's death. His transformation from torturer to liberator was complete, driven by guilt and shame, but also by a growing recognition that some forms of justice could only be achieved through blood. The woman who had ordered my mouth sewn shut was about to discover that voices could not be permanently silenced, and that the needle she had used to torture me would soon find a new and more fitting purpose in the service of justice. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Dr. Whitfield made his way through the darkened corridors of the Harlow mansion, carrying his medical bag and the weight of his own moral transformation. Behind him, the house slept in ignorance of the revolution that was about to unfold in its heart, unaware that the natural order they took for granted was about to be shattered by a woman they had considered property. I lay in my small room, listening to his careful footsteps approaching, feeling a mixture of anticipation and terror as the moment of my liberation drew near. For 3 weeks I had lived with my mouth sealed shut, unable to speak, barely able to eat, existing in a state of enforced silence that had nearly driven me mad. But that silence was about to end, and with it would begin the final act of a drama that would conclude with Beatrix's death. Dr. Whitfield entered my room without knocking, his face pale but determined in the moonlight that filtered through the small window. He had made his choice, had crossed the line from reluctant participant to active conspirator, and there was no turning back from what we were about to do together. "Are you ready?" he whispered, setting his medical bag on the small table beside my bed. I nodded, music, unable to speak, but able to communicate my determination through my eyes. For 3 weeks I had been preparing for this moment, planning my revenge with the patience of someone who understood that justice delayed music was not justice denied. It was justice refined, made more perfect by careful consideration and meticulous preparation. "This will hurt," he warned, as he began cutting the stitches that had held my mouth closed for so long. "The tissue has grown around the thread, and removing it will cause fresh bleeding." I welcomed the pain as a small price to pay for the return of my voice and the freedom to act on the plans that had been forming in my mind during the long weeks of enforced silence. The first stitch came free with a sharp tug that sent blood streaming down my chin. But I felt no pain, only the overwhelming relief of being able to open my mouth for the first time in 3 weeks. "There," Dr. Whitfield said as the last stitch was cut away, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're free." I opened my mouth slowly, testing the movement, feeling the torn flesh protest, but gradually responding to my will. When I finally spoke, my voice was hoarse and damaged, but it carried a strength that surprised us both. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful after so long without speech. "Now help me finish this." "What do you need?" and he asked, though his face showed that he already suspected the answer. "The same needle and thread you used on me," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. "And some of that laudanum she takes every night. It's time for Beatrix to learn what it feels like to be silenced." Dr. Whitfield reached into his medical bag and withdrew the instruments I had requested, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what we were planning. The needle gleamed in the moonlight, its sharp point carrying the promise of justice that had sustained me through 3 weeks of agony. "She usually takes her evening dose at 10 o'clock, he said as he prepared the additional laudanum that would ensure Beatrice remained unconscious during the procedure. "By now, she'll be deeply asleep. This extra dose will keep her unconscious for at least 4 hours, long enough for you to complete your work and escape before anyone discovers what's happened." "Perfect," I said, testing my voice again and finding it adequate for what needed to be done. "By morning, she'll understand exactly what she put me through, and she'll never hurt anyone again." I took the needle and thread from his hands, feeling their weight and understanding the terrible symmetry of what was about to happen. The same tools that had been used to torture me would now become the instruments of my revenge, the means by which justice would finally be served in a world that offered no other recourse for people like me. "What about afterward?" Dr. Whitfield asked. "What will you do once it's finished?" "I'll disappear," I said simply. "I have contacts among the Underground Railroad conductors who can help me reach the north. By the time her body is discovered, I'll be miles away from here." "And if you're caught," he pressed, "if they somehow discover what really happened, then I'll die knowing that I struck back against music evil," I replied without hesitation. "I'll die knowing that I proved slaves are human beings capable of justice, capable of resistance, capable of making moral choices even under the most impossible circumstances." Dr. Whitfield nodded, understanding that I had found a peace with my actions that he might never achieve with his own. "Go," he said, "go quickly before anyone discovers what we've done. And Mercy, thank you for showing me what courage looks like." I left my room and made my way through the darkened corridors of the Harlow mansion, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent 8 years learning every creaking floorboard and squeaking hinge in the house. In my hand, I carried the needle and thread that would serve as instruments of justice, music, along with the vial of laudanum that would ensure Beatrice remained unconscious during the procedure she was about to experience. The irony was not lost on me that I was using the same tools that had been used to torture me, that the very instruments of my suffering would now become the means of my revenge. There was a poetic justice in the symmetry that appealed to something deep in my soul, the victim becoming the executioner, the silenced finding her voice through the silencing of her oppressor. Beatrice's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the deep, regular breathing that indicated she was in the profound sleep that came from her nightly dose of laudanum. She had always been dependent on the drug to quiet the demons that haunted her dreams, the guilt and emptiness that she tried so hard to hide beneath layers of cruelty and social pretension. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges, but Beatrice did not stir. She lay on her back in the center of the large four-poster bed, her mouth slightly open, her face relaxed in sleep in a way that made her look almost innocent. But I knew better than to be deceived by appearances. This was the same woman who had ordered my mouth sewn shut, who had taken pleasure in my suffering, who had reduced me to an object for her entertainment. The moonlight streaming through the windows provided enough illumination for what I needed to do, casting everything in silver and shadow like a scene from a nightmare. I approached the bed slowly, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet, my heart beating steadily despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. Beatrice stirred slightly as I reached the bedside, but the additional laudanum that Dr. Whitfield had provided kept her deeply unconscious. I had learned from him exactly how much of the drug would be needed to ensure she remained asleep during the procedure. And I had calculated the dosage with the precision of someone whose life depended on getting it right. "Time for you to learn what silence feels like," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Time for you to understand what you put me through." I began with the same methodical approach that Dr. Whitfield had used on me, threading the needle with the thick cotton thread and preparing to create the same pattern of stitches that had held my mouth closed for 3 weeks. But there was a crucial difference. Where Dr. Whitfield had been reluctant and guilt-ridden, I was calm and purposeful, driven by a sense of justice that made my hands steady and my resolve unshakable. The first stitch pierced her lower lip with surgical precision, and I felt a deep satisfaction as I drew the thread through her flesh. She moaned softly in her drugged sleep, but did not wake, her body too deeply sedated to respond to the pain that would have had her screaming if she were conscious. "This is for 3 weeks of agony," I said as I made the second stitch, my voice growing stronger with each word. "This is for the infection you caused, for the weight I lost, for the humiliation of being unable to speak in my own defense. I continued working with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Each stitch a deliberate act of retribution that brought me closer to the justice I had been denied by every legal and social system that existed in our world. The law would never punish Beatrice for what she had done to me. In the eyes of society, she had every right to discipline her property in whatever way she saw fit. But there was a higher law at work here, a moral justice that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and class and ownership. Beatrice had chosen to treat me as less than human. And now she would experience what it felt like to be reduced to the level of a helpless animal, unable to speak or cry out or defend herself. This is for every slave you've tortured, I continued as the stitches multiplied, slowly sealing her mouth just as mine had been sealed. This is for every person you've treated as property, every life you've destroyed with your casual cruelty. The work was almost meditative in its precision, each stitch a prayer for justice, each pull of the thread a step closer to the resolution I had been seeking, since the moment Dr. Whitfield first pierced my flesh with his needle. I found myself thinking about all the other slaves who had suffered under Beatrice's rule, all the people who had been broken by her cruelty, but who had never found the opportunity to strike back. I was not just taking revenge for myself. I was acting as an instrument of justice for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system, music that Beatrice represented. Every stitch was a voice crying out for recognition. Every thread was a life demanding to be acknowledged as human and worthy of respect. As I neared completion of my work, Beatrice began to stir more restlessly, the laudanum starting to wear off as her body fought to wake up and respond to the trauma being inflicted upon it, but it was too late. Her mouth was nearly sealed, and even if she woke up now, she would find herself in the same helpless position that I had occupied for 3 weeks. "Wake up, music Beatrice," I said softly as I tied off the final stitch. "Wake up and discover what you've created." Her eyes fluttered open. Music slowly, confusion clouding her features as she struggled to understand where she was and what was happening to her. I watched with fascination as awareness gradually returned as she realized that something was wrong with her mouth as she tried to speak and found that she could not. The panic that filled her eyes was beautiful to behold, the same terror and helplessness that I had felt when I first realized what had been done to me. She tried to sit up. Music tried to reach for her mouth, but I was ready for her movements and easily restrained her weakened arms. "Don't struggle," I said, my voice calm and soothing in a way that made her panic even more intense. "You'll only make it worse. Just lie still and experience what you put me through." She tried to scream then, but the sound that emerged was nothing more than a muffled moan, barely audible through the stitches that held her lips together. The frustration and terror in her eyes was exactly what I had hoped to music see. The recognition that she was now the victim, that the power dynamic had shifted completely in my favor. "You can't speak," I observed with clinical detachment. "You can't call for help, can't give orders. Music can't use your voice to hurt anyone else. For the first time in your life, you're truly powerless." The terror in Beatrice's eyes was exquisite, as she fully grasped the magnitude of her situation, understanding that the woman she had tried to music silence forever had found her voice again, and was using it to narrate her destruction. I settled into the chair beside her bed, making myself comfortable, as if I were a visitor making a social call rather than an executioner preparing to complete her work. "I could leave you like this," I said conversationally. "Music." My voice carrying the same casual tone she had used when discussing my torture with Dr. Whitfield. "I could let you live with your mouth sewn shut, music. Let you experience weeks or months of the agony you inflicted on me, but I'm not as cruel as music you are, Beatrice. I'm going to end your suffering much more quickly than you ended mine." The realization that this was music, not just punishment but execution, sent a new wave of panic through her body. She began to struggle more violently against my restraining hands, but the laudanum had weakened her muscles, and I was easily able to hold her down. Her muffled attempts to scream grew more desperate, but the thick walls of the plantation house ensured that no one would hear her cries for help. "The beautiful thing about your situation," I continued, my voice taking on the same clinical tone that Dr. Whitfield had used when describing medical procedures, "is that you're going to die the same way you almost killed me, choking on your own blood, unable to breathe properly, unable to call for help. The only difference is that I'm going to make sure you don't survive the experience." I reached into the pocket of my dress and withdrew the small knife that I had taken from the kitchen earlier that evening, its blade sharp enough to do what needed to be, music done. Beatrice's eyes widened with terror as she saw the weapon, understanding finally that her life was about to end, and music, that there was nothing she could do to prevent it. "This is for my voice," I said as I made the first small cut inside her mouth, severing blood vessels that would cause her to slowly drown in her own blood. "This is for my dignity. This is for my humanity that you tried so hard to destroy." The blood, music, began to flow immediately, pooling in her mouth behind the stitches that prevented it from escaping. I watched with satisfaction as panic filled her eyes, music, as she realized that she was going to die exactly as I had described, choking on her own blood, unable to breathe, unable to speak, unable to do anything but experience the terror and helplessness that she, music, had inflicted on so many others. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked, leaning closer so that she could see every detail of my face, every scar left by the stitches she had ordered. "The worst part is that you're going to die knowing that your property, music, your possession, your thing that you tried to silence, has found her voice again, and that voice is, music, the last thing you'll ever hear." Beatrice's struggles grew weaker as the blood filled her mouth and throat, music, as her body fought desperately for air that could not reach her lungs. I sat beside music, her bed, and watched every moment of her death, memorizing the fear in her eyes, the futile movements of her hands, the gradual fading of life from her face. "You created this moment," I told her gently, my voice carrying the same soothing tone that a mother might use to comfort a frightened child. "Every cruel word, music, every casual violence, every moment when you chose to treat human beings, music, as objects for your entertainment, it all led to this. You made me into your destroyer. Beatrice, you have no one to blame but yourself." The irony was perfect and complete. The woman who had found such pleasure in observing the suffering of others was now the subject of music observation herself, watched with clinical interest as she experienced the same terror and helplessness she had inflicted on countless victims. The needle, music, that had sewn my mouth shut had found its perfect purpose in sealing hers. Music, and the voice she had tried to silence forever, was speaking the last words she would ever hear. As Beatrice's movements grew more feeble and her eyes, music, began to lose focus, I found myself thinking about all the people who had suffered under her rule, all the lives she had destroyed with her casual cruelty. Little Emma, who had been beaten for dropping a plate, Sarah, music, who had been forced to stand in the sun for 12 hours, Moses, who had been made to sleep in the stables, all the unnamed, uncounted victims, music, whose pain had been nothing more than entertainment for a woman who had confused power with purpose. "This is for all of them," I whispered as Beatrice's eyes finally closed, music, for the last time. "This is for every person you reduced to property, every music child you terrorized, every human being whose dignity you tried to destroy." They couldn't strike back, but I could. And I did. The woman who had sewn my mouth shut was dead, choked on her own blood, just as she had nearly caused me to choke on mine. Justice had been served with the same needle and thread that had been used, music, to torture me, and the voice that she had tried to silence forever had spoken the last words she would ever hear. I sat in the silence for several minutes, music, feeling a profound sense of completion settle over me like a warm blanket. The rage, music, that had sustained me through 3 weeks of agony was finally satisfied, replaced, music, by a calm certainty that I had done what needed to be done. The world was a safer place without Beatrice Harlow in it, and music, the other slaves on the plantation, would no longer live in fear of her creative punishments and casual cruelties. But my work, music, was not yet finished. I needed to stage the scene to support the story that Dr. Whitfield would tell when the body was, music, discovered, and I needed to escape before dawn brought the household staff, who would find their mistress dead in her bed. I arranged Beatrix's music body to suggest that she had sewn her own mouth shut in a fit of madness, placing the needle and remaining music thread beside her hand as if she had dropped them after completing the final stitch. The Lord bottle was positioned on her nightstand, suggesting that she had taken an overdose before beginning her self-inflicted torture. The scene would puzzle investigators, music, but it would also provide a plausible explanation for what had happened. Beatrice's increasing instability and cruelty, music, had been noted by everyone who knew her, and the idea that guilt over her treatment of me had finally driven her to madness would be easier for the authorities to accept than the truth of what had actually, music, occurred. I cleaned the knife and returned it to the kitchen, erasing any evidence of my presence in Beatrice's room. My bare feet had left no tracks on the thick carpets, and I had been careful not to touch anything that might retain fingerprints or, music, other traces of my involvement. The final step was to return to my own room and wait for Dr. Music Whitfield to discover the body during his morning rounds. We had agreed that he would be the one to find Beatrice, ensuring that his medical expertise would lend credibility, music, to whatever explanation he provided for her death. I made my way back through the darkened corridors, moving with the same silent efficiency that had carried me to Beatrix's room. But now I walked as a free woman, rather than as property. My voice restored and my humanity reclaimed through an act of justice that no court would ever acknowledge, but that satisfied every moral law that mattered. Dr. Whitfield was waiting in my room when I returned, his face pale with anxiety, but his resolve firm. He had prepared everything I would need for my escape, traveling clothes, money, and detailed music directions to the Underground Railroad station that would begin my journey to freedom. "Is it done?" he asked quietly, though my expression had already given him the answer he expected. "It's done," Music, I replied, my voice steady and clear. "She'll never hurt anyone again." He nodded slowly, his medical training allowing him to understand exactly what I had done without needing the details spelled out Music for him. "I'll discover the body during my morning rounds," he said. "The scene you've created should support the suicide theory, her increasing instability, and the guilt over what she Music did to you. It will all make sense to the authorities." "What about you?" I asked. "What will you do, Music, after this?" "I'll continue practicing medicine," he replied, "but I'll also do everything in my power to help other slaves escape to freedom. It's the only way I can begin to atone for what I've done." I changed into the traveling clothes he had provided. A simple dress and bonnet that would help me blend Music in with other travelers on the roads leading north. The clothes were plain, but Music well made, suitable for a free woman of modest means rather than a runaway slave, and they represented the first step in my transformation from property to person. "There's $100 in this pouch," Dr. Whitfield said, handing me a leather bag that contained more money than I had ever seen, Music, in my life. "It should be enough to get you established somewhere safe to build a new life as a free woman." "Why are you doing this?" I asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. "You could report what I've done, claim ignorance of my plans, probably avoid any consequences for your part in this because I'm tired of being a coward," he replied with brutal honesty. "I've spent my entire career doing whatever was necessary to maintain my comfortable position, Music, regardless of the moral cost. But watching what I did to you, seeing the courage you showed in the face of unimaginable suffering, it made me realize that some things are more important than safety." The Underground Railroad contact was waiting at the old mill 5 miles north of the plantation, just as Dr. Whitfield had promised. Samuel was a tall, dignified man whose bearing suggested Music that he had been born free and had dedicated his life to helping others achieve the same status. He greeted me, Music, with the respect due to a fellow human being rather than the condescension typically shown to runaway property. "Dr. Whitfield told me about your situation," he said simply. "I'm here to help you reach safety. Are you ready to begin your journey to freedom?" "I've been ready my entire life," and I replied. The journey north took 3 weeks, following a route that had been used by thousands of fugitives before me. I traveled by night and hid by day, staying in safe houses operated by abolitionists who asked no questions about my past, but provided food, shelter, and encouragement for the future I was building. It was during this journey that I began to understand the full significance of what I had done. The story of my resistance was already spreading through the network of communication that connected enslaved communities throughout the South. I was becoming a symbol of something larger than my individual act of revenge. I was becoming proof that resistance was possible, that slaves could strike back against their oppressors, that the system of human bondage was not as secure as its defenders believed. "You're famous," one conductor told me as we traveled through Virginia. "The story of the slave who silenced her mistress, Music, is being told in slave quarters from Georgia to Maryland. People are calling you a hero and inspiration, proof that we don't have to accept our fate quietly." "I'm not a hero," I replied. "I'm just someone who refused to be broken. That's what makes you a hero," he said. "Heroes aren't people who are born brave. They're people who find the courage to do what's right when everything else tells them to stay quiet and accept injustice." I reached Philadelphia in January 1855, Music arriving in a city that bustled with commerce and opportunity, where free black people walked the streets without fear, and where my voice could be heard without the threat of violent retribution. The contrast with the plantation was overwhelming. Here were people of all colors working together, children attending school instead of laboring in fields, families living together without fear of being sold apart. I found work as a seamstress in a shop owned by a Quaker family who asked no questions about my past, but welcomed me as a skilled music worker, deserving of fair wages and respectful treatment. The work was honest and dignified, a far cry from the unpaid labor music had performed under threat of violence. But more importantly, it was work I chose for myself. Labor. I performed as a free person rather than as property, music compelled to serve others' interests. The scars around my mouth served as a constant reminder of what I had endured and what I had done to escape it. People who saw them often asked about their origin, and I learned to tell my story in ways that inspired rather than horrified, focusing on the triumph of resistance rather than the details of revenge. I was silenced for speaking truth, I would say. But silence taught me that actions can speak louder than words, that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that refuses music to be stilled. The news of Beatrix's death reached Philadelphia through the network of communication that connected abolitionists throughout the country. The official story, as reported in the newspapers, was exactly what Dr. Whitfield and I had planned. A tragic suicide by a plantation mistress who had been driven to madness by guilt over her treatment of her slaves. Beatrice Harlow, found dead in apparent suicide, read the headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Georgia plantation owner discovered with mouth sewn shut in bizarre self-inflicted torture. The article went on to describe how Dr. Whitfield had found her body during his morning rounds, and how the evidence suggested that she had taken an overdose of laudanum before sewing her own mouth shut in a fit of madness. Mrs. Harlow had been showing signs of increasing instability in recent months. Dr. Whitfield was quoted as saying, "She had become obsessed with punishing slaves for minor infractions and had recently ordered me to perform a similar procedure on one of her house slaves. It appears that guilt over her actions finally drove her to inflict the same torture upon herself." The story was accepted without question by the authorities, music who found it easier to believe in a white woman's madness than in a slave's successful revenge. The investigation was perfunctory. Music. The case was quickly closed and Beatrice was buried with all the honors due to a respected member of Southern society. But among the enslaved population, a different story was being told. The truth of what had happened spread through the underground networks that connected plantations throughout the South, inspiring acts of resistance and rebellion that contributed to the growing tension between North and South. The silenced woman found her voice became a rallying cry among slaves who had heard the story. She proved that we are not animals, that we can think and plan and strike back when pushed too far. I lived quietly in Philadelphia for 20 years, building a life based on dignity and self-determination rather than submission and fear. I never married. The trauma of my experiences had left me unable to trust in the possibility of normal relationships. But I found fulfillment in my work, my community, and my role as a living example of successful resistance. I became involved in the Underground Railroad music using my own experience as a fugitive to help others escape from bondage. I provided safe harbor in my small apartment, contributed money to support music, the network of conductors and safe houses, and shared my story with other refugees who needed to understand that freedom was possible even for those who seemed most powerless. The story of what I had done continued to spread and evolve, becoming part of the folklore that sustained enslaved people, music, through the darkest periods of their bondage. Sometimes the details were changed in the telling. I became younger or older. The revenge became more or less elaborate. The escape became more or less dramatic, but the essential message remained the same. Resistance was possible. Dignity could be maintained. Music, and voices could not be permanently silenced. During the Civil War, my story took on new significance as enslaved people throughout the South began to see the possibility of freedom on the horizon. Union soldiers reported hearing versions of my tale in slave quarters from Virginia to Texas, always told us proof that resistance was possible and that the system of human bondage could be overthrown by those who found the courage to fight music back. The woman who silenced her mistress showed us the way. One former slave told a Union officer, "She proved that we don't have to wait for someone else to free us. We can free ourselves if we're willing to pay the price." After the war ended, music and slavery was officially abolished, I began to speak more openly about my experiences, addressing gatherings of former slaves and abolitionists' music who wanted to understand the realities of resistance under bondage. I never revealed the full details of what I had done to Beatrice. That secret died with me. But I spoke about the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They tried to silence our voices, music I would tell these audiences. But they only succeeded in teaching us that actions can speak louder than words. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, is a declaration of our humanity. Every refusal to accept degradation, music, is a victory for the human spirit. The scars around my mouth became a symbol of resistance for those who heard my story. Proof that even the most brutal music, attempts to silence dissent, could be overcome by those who refused to surrender their humanity. Children would music reach out to touch the marks, understanding instinctively that they represented something important about the struggle for freedom and dignity. I died in 1875 at the age of 47, my body finally succumbing to the long-term effects of the infection that had nearly killed me 21 years earlier. But my death was peaceful, music surrounded by friends who had known me as a free woman rather than as property. In a city where my voice had been heard and respected, my funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Former slaves who had found inspiration in my story, music abolitionists who had supported my work with the Underground Railroad, and ordinary citizens who understood that I represented something important about the American struggle for freedom and justice. The eulogy was delivered by Frederick Douglass, who had become a friend during my years in Philadelphia, and who understood better than most the significance of what I had accomplished. Mercy died as she lived in freedom, with dignity, music with purpose, and with the knowledge that her voice had been heard, he said. She proved that no system of oppression, no matter how brutal, music, or pervasive, can permanently silence the human spirit. Her story reminds us that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away. It is something that lives inside each of us, waiting for the moment when we find the courage to claim it. My last words, according to those who were present, music were, I spoke with my actions. The woman who had been silenced for 3 weeks had found her voice again. And that voice had echoed through the decades, music inspiring others to resist, to fight back, to refuse to accept that their humanity could be, music denied, or their dignity destroyed. Beatrice Harlow had tried to silence me forever, but she had only succeeded in transforming my voice into something more powerful than words, into actions, music that spoke of justice, resistance, and the unbreakable human spirit that music refuses to be conquered, no matter how systematic the attempt to destroy it. This was the story of Mercy, who chose justice over safety, action over submission, and resistance over acceptance. Her act of revenge became a symbol of hope for enslaved people throughout the South. Proof that even the most powerless could find ways to strike back against their oppressors. Beatrice Harlow's death was officially ruled a suicide, with Dr. Whitfield's testimony supporting the theory that guilt over her treatment of Mercy had driven her to inflict the same torture on herself. The authorities found it easier to accept this explanation than to acknowledge that a slave had successfully planned and executed such sophisticated revenge. Dr. Whitfield continued practicing medicine, but became a secret supporter of the Underground Railroad, using his position and resources to help over 200 enslaved people escape to freedom before his death in 1889. He never spoke publicly about his role in Mercy's escape, taking that secret to his grave. The Harlow plantation was sold after Beatrix's death and eventually divided among several smaller farmers. The main house was destroyed by fire in 1867, and local legend claimed that the flames could be seen for miles, burning with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. The story of Mercy's resistance spread throughout the enslaved community, inspiring acts of defiance and rebellion that contributed to the growing tension between North and South. Her example proved that slaves were capable of sophisticated planning, moral reasoning, and heroic action under the most oppressive circumstances. During Reconstruction, several former slaves came forward with their own accounts of Mercy's story, each adding details that had been preserved in the oral tradition of their communities. These testimonies were collected by historians and became part of the permanent record of slave resistance in America. A small memorial garden was planted in Philadelphia where Mercy's apartment had stood, with a simple stone marker bearing the inscription in memory of those who found their voices through their actions, who proved that the human spirit cannot be permanently silenced. The echoes of Mercy's story continue to resonate today, a reminder that voices cannot be permanently silenced, that dignity cannot be destroyed, and that resistance takes many forms. Her tale shows us that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not words, but actions, not speeches, but the simple refusal to accept that our humanity can be denied. In an age when many people feel powerless against systematic oppression, Mercy's example reminds us that individual acts of courage can have ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. Her willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice inspired others to resist, to fight back, to refuse to accept that their voices could be stolen. Her story also illustrates the complex moral landscape of resistance under extreme oppression, where traditional notions of right and wrong become meaningless in the face of systematic dehumanization. The woman who killed her mistress was not a criminal, but a freedom fighter, striking back against a system that had reduced her to property and tried to steal her voice forever. If these stories of courage and resistance inspire you, join our community dedicated to preserving the hidden histories of those who fought back against injustice. Subscribe to discover more accounts of moral courage and human dignity from throughout history, and share your thoughts on how these narratives continue to inform our understanding of resistance and justice today. These stories matter not just as historical accounts, but as reminders that we all have voices and that those voices, whether expressed through words or actions, cannot be permanently silenced by those who seek to oppress us.